And welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I am Chris Mackowski, and I'm pleased today to be joined by two guests who are here to talk about their newest release in our Engaging the Civil War series, published in cooperation with Southern Illinois University Press. So please welcome Paul Ashdown and Ed Caudill. Paul, Ed, thanks for being with me today.
Glad to be here.
So now, when you say glad to be here, you guys are both in parts far away. So, Paul, where are you at? And then Ed, I'll switch over to you.
Chapel Hill, North Carolina.
And I'm among the Hilligans in Tennessee.
Hilligans, what a great word. And the book we're talking about today is Imagining Wild Bill, James Butler Hickok in War, Media, and Memory. And this is the latest in a series of memory studies that the two of you have been working on. And I'll ask you to kind of contextualize this book for me in the work that you guys have done already with these sort of figures in this sort of way.
Yeah, it's a big question. Years ago, maybe 20 years ago, Ed and I had a number of coffee conversations and kind of kicking some ideas around. And one of the ideas that sort of came to the fore was this idea that, war is something like a depth charge to the public consciousness, and all kinds of strange characters sort of float to the surface. And then years and years after, these characters, some of them become mythic figures. And so we just started writing down names of characters that came out of the Civil War era that everybody knew something about, but were more myth than reality. And so the first one we picked was John Singleton Mosby, who, of course, back in your area around Fredericksburg, the gray ghost, been the subject of a television program, and had became a mythical figure. And we followed that up with Nathan Bedford Forrest, another kind of mythical figure in the Civil War. And then we took Sherman and Sherman's March. And then we went to Custer. And so then we thought, well, what's next? Why don't we find another figure who perhaps wasn't a general or a colonel, but maybe an enlisted man who also came out of the war as a mythical figure. And that suggested Hickok. Many people don't know that he was in the Civil War, and we found some interesting stuff about him.
Yeah, he was very much part of it. And I think he's an interesting Civil War figure in as much as he's, I think, more than any of the other characters we've looked at, he's more myth than he is historic figure. Not to be overly severe about it, I'm not a Hickok fan, but in the sense of, I don't wear my 6-shooter strapped around like Paul does, but, but really, he didn't accomplish a whole lot. But he's a heck of a story, just an incredible story. Now, our other guys, they were men of accomplishment in the war, even the ones you can't like Nathan Bedford Forrest.
And that's coming from a guy who's in Tennessee.
Yeah, I'd better be careful.
Statement.
Have a mob in my yard in the morning.
Yeah, we tread lightly with that.
When you talk about Hickok being more myth than reality, I mean, even his name, James Butler Hickok, like Bill isn't even in there. And yet we know him as Wild Bill. So there's got to be a lot of story to this guy.
Yeah, hundreds of stories. That's a good way to start. I have the feeling after reading voluminously about this, that Hickok was the kind of guy that we all know. We come across people like this. People sidle up to him at a bar or at walking down the street, and they say, "Hey, aren't you Wild Bill Hickok?" And he never really denied anything. It was always, "Yep, that's me. Understanding the war, you did all kinds of stuff. Yep. Somebody told me you killed 200 men. Could be, this kind of thing, So without denying or going around boasting, the myth just grew and grew and grew. And I know some football players like this, where people are just desperate to have them recount their famous run, their famous score, and they're sick of it. So they just go along with
it. And along with everything then.
Everything, yeah.
Yeah, and he's also a character that's easy to mythologize. Because the first thing about a lot of these mythic characters he died properly.
Yeah, very important.
In a spray of blood all over the card table. I mean, that's what you need for a good myth. You don't want to die whining in bed. That's not a good myth. But also, he's a guy, he's good looking, and he comes along as photography is emerging. So there were plenty of pictures of him available to us and to the people of the period. Lots of sketches of him that could be reproduced cheaply in the dime novels and newspapers of the day, and were wildly popular. So his timing is good too, for these kinds of things.
So
yeah,
let's go ahead, Paul.
What was your question, Chris?
Oh no, you were going to add something.
No, I was going to say that the reason that he became mythological associated with the Civil War was the fact that he starts out the war in Kansas. He's in bloody, bleeding Kansas. And then he's in that Western theater that's so interesting because we don't know quite as much about it. He's in Missouri and Kansas primarily. But his main role seemed to have been a scout and sometimes a spy. Now, how much are you going to know about a scout or a spy? They don't file reports at the end of the battle. And most of what we know about Hickok is basically tall tales. He apparently did get behind the Confederate lines in many situations. There's stories that he actually impersonated a general, that he was able to get himself ingratiated with Confederate figures, and then they finally figure out that he's really a Union guy, and they chase him dramatically across miles of open country, and the horses leaping over water and this. And of course, these kinds of stories are great. They're much better than what probably happened in the war itself. He's mostly a scout, and he's also a sharpshooter. This is another thing you don't hear too much about in the war, the memories of a sharpshooter. I'm sure there are such books, but Hickok, was in that gray area of being a crack shot, but maybe picking off one too many people he shouldn't have been shooting. So this is all very vague. He's kind of hero at the end of the war, but nobody can kind of pin down anything that he actually did.
Well, and the stories about his shooting ability,
phenomenal.
It's inane. I mean, it can't be. The best one I ever read on his sharpshooting ability was with a pistol. Now, remember, we're talking 1867, 68, 69. He's able to split a bullet on a dime turned sideways at 25 or 30 yards. And, no, that I can tell you without having been there, it didn't happen. But it's a wonderful story. How could you do any better than that? Or he shoots a crow out of the sky with a pistol.
As I understand it, Ed, the fish that's on the wall behind you is one that Wild Bill Hickok shot from halfway across the river. And
well, it was actually twice as big as that, but that's all they could had a mold for, so I had to.
So he's got this air of heroism around him, even if he doesn't necessarily have concrete stuff to work with. So that somehow turns into this legendary figure. How does that process happen?
Great question, and that's the essence of the book. And I'll just start with the first anecdote, and then Ed can expand on this because he dug into it much more deeply. What happened was a lieutenant colonel named George Nichols was in Springfield just at the end of the war. He was on active duty, and the war wasn't quite over yet. Somebody told him about this scout, this miraculous scout. Turned out to be Hickok. So he interviews Hickok and finds him a fascinating character. Who wouldn't? And he works up this story. He's a journalist in private life. He's basically specialty is art and music. But he served with Sherman during Sherman's march, and he wrote a history of Sherman's march it's actually a pretty good book. Anyway, so when he meets Hickok, he just takes all these stories and anecdotes that he's heard, and he puts them together in a kind of incredible, fabulous article that gets published in Harper's Weekly, and in 1867. And the thing is an immediate sensation. And so Hickok at that point, Hickok, it becomes a national figure. And he's not really even aware of it. I mean, when the magazine comes out, people are saying, hey, you know, you're in the front page of this national magazine. And he's sort of awestruck. He just thought he was talking to a guy that was interested in his career. And that triggers everything. And next, what do we have, Ed? Isn't it Stanley next?
Yeah, the explorer, no less. And, you know, the thing about it is, when we say the right time, the right place, good timing for him, well, remember, he comes along and I think he's got two things really going for him. What the Civil War has done, it doesn't invent, but it amplifies the idea for American culture that violence solves problems. And that's true to this day. We maintain that attitude that the way you solve a problem is to shoot them. I mean, our president, I'm sure, would endorse me on that point, but in all seriousness, then and now. So what do? You can't make an icon out of the Union Army, but you can out of individuals, especially in a culture so enamored of individualism. That's us. Mm-hmm. And still that way, even when we're utter failures at our individualism, we cling to the myth. And that happens, of course, with generals, and properly so. It did with every one of the characters that we did earlier works on. And Hickok's just a good one. He may not be likable, but he's individualistic for sure. And culture is ready to embrace this solution. Now, I said the Civil War solved the problem of disunion and slavery with violence. Solved is probably not a very good way to put it. But keep in mind what we do consequently. We've got a problem out west, Indians. There were two views of what you do with them: assimilate or exterminate. And of course, you see a bit of both at work, but Sherman was an advocate of exterminate. And so how do you solve the Indian problem? According to lots of people, you get rid of them, kill them all. That was not an uncommon view at the time. And so when it comes to settling the land, you go with a gun. I mean, yeah, it's just as important as your mule. And to this day, I would insist, we've got a problem with crime. The solution is not more mental health expenditures, not eradicating poverty, etc. That's not very interesting anyhow. But you shoot them, electrocute them. That is a solution. And Wild Bill personifies that to this day.
And he's also, you know, coming of age at a time where America's fascination with the expansion out west is very romanticized. And mm-hmm. in a way, it seems like him becoming him is a way to sanitize some of what you're talking about.
Oh, I think that's true. And sanitize is a good word for it. And of course, the thing you get with someone like him, and I hadn't thought about it in terms of sanitation, but he's good to look at.
Yeah.
You know, he's one of the Westerners, maybe a minority at that time, that takes a bath on a regular basis and puts on a clean clothes. Now I'll have a bunch of people at me.
You said, yeah, you know, this is also publicity for the Army. And that had something to do with Nichols' motive in this. And the Army, remember, you know, they're putting soldiers into the West for this pacification and expansion. They're trying to protect the railroads. And so you've got all these veterans, of which Hickok is a representative, all of them trying to get by in the expanding West. And the Army needs good press. And so anything written about their hero scout and similar figures, of course, is going to be favorably received. So Hickok was very good he made led a scout for General Sherman, for example. He was personally close to Sherman. He was also close to General Pope, and he was worked with Custer quite a bit. Custer loved him. There's a publicity figure for you.
Yeah, right.
The two of them got along fabulously. So, I mean, anything that made the Army look good or made the Army, the military in the area more palatable and more acceptable as it went about its business that Ed just described about, pacifying and the violence and so forth was going to be well received. There's a good figure for the press in that sense.
Well, as far as the press goes, I don't think we can overstate the importance then and now that violence is entertaining. It was great dime novel material.
Yeah.
And turn on the TV tonight. I promise you can find somebody getting killed.
You can find it on the news. You don't even have to look at the
Yeah.
Well, this is true.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we've got a chapter in the book about 2 chapters about television and movies. And of course, there's hundreds of movies that have been made of these Western figures, and Hickok figures in a lot of them. And some of them are so absurdly violent that you just almost stunned by this. The more recent movie with, I think, Jeff Bridges, I counted the number of people that were shot, slashed, decanted, beaten over the head with heavy objects. It went on through the whole movie. And of course, there is something about this that's weirdly fascinating. You want that kind of level of excitement. We've turned this into an entertainment industry. Now, I have to say that I don't think Hickok, per se, from what we've read, he had his bad moments, but he wasn't a notoriously violent, sadistic human being. He got into all kinds of situations, usually involving prostitutes, drinking. He was involved with any number of brawls with Army soldiers, because a lot of his policing work was off Army bases, and these are rough places. And he got into these situations, and he killed, what is the estimate, Ed? About 9, 10 people tops.
10 was the most reliable number I've seen. I think that was from Joseph Rosa, one of the more credible biographers. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, some of the biographies rank hundreds and hundreds of deaths that are supposed to be associated with him. But I mean, certainly a tough character, but not a mass murderer or anything like that. In fact, he spent time as a lawman. He was a deputy U.S. Marshal in several cities, and these are the roughest possible cattle towns. And he got, as you would expect, involved in some altercations and killings in those places. Tough place to be a lawman, particularly in that time period.
You mentioned just a second ago about one of the more credible biographers suggesting that there are many non-credible biographers. And I remember early in the process, as we were pulling the book together, you're like, oh, we got to get this out because such and such's biographies out there peddling this same old garbage. That's got to be frustrating for guys who are really trying to stay grounded, to be constantly fighting a myth that continues to be perpetuated.
We've got a great chapter in the book that's historiography, that mostly Ed's work, and we went over every single biography that had been written, all the way back to the first one, Buell.
Buell.
Buell. And Buell claimed to have gotten all his information from here I go again, Hickox Diary. Now, there is no diary. We've never found a diary. No diary exists. None has ever been found. So what this book was based on, who knows? And from there, it was one after the other. Each biography more incredible than the previous one. Some of them were, talk about that, Ed, some of the ones.
Well, of course, you get with these guys, and starting with Nichols, the guy who's writing the dime novel material, but up through the biographers. See, unlike us modern academics, we get a paycheck at the end of the month. Well, these guys got a paycheck when they sold a book. So what do? You write a saleable book. And there's nothing to be, nobody's going to buy a book that says, Well, we don't know much about Wild Bill. You know, he was born in the Midwest, and he meandered around, and he accidentally shot a guy in Abilene, his own deputy, which didn't look good. This is not good. I'm not going to buy that. And of course, this is the pre-mass media era, so it's entertainment. I'm not worried about the facticity of the biographer. Now, this starts to change in the 20s and 30s. A few biographers come along that start to incorporate what I think they believe is good material. However, there's not a lot of primary historical sources on Hickok. So unlike, say, Custer or Sherman, you can't go down to the archive, drag out some letters, and see what he said. Mm-hmm. I think really what you're limited to, and I've seen this in the biographies, are the newspapers and the magazines. And these so-called biographies, the early ones especially, they're based on newspaper accounts, which are sensationalist.
Sure.
You got to sell them. And that's what people were doing. And of course, you see this kind of thing manifest in different ways up to the current day, that we've got to sell this some way. And of course, Paul and I were, well, I guess he was retired and I was a full professor and tenured, so I didn't have to worry about selling a lot of them. So we could write about these vaporous subjects like myth and culture, you know.
Although I want to stress, though, it's a really readable book, and it's the whole reason I liked it in the first place.
Yeah, well, we're both journalists, so we kind of impersonate academics, and we tried to keep in mind that if we were going to write it, we wanted it to be readable, even if it was academic prose. And sometimes you run into these books. These people that write these books can write, but they get so weighed down with the sources that the book just takes on a kind of wooden quality to it. And we tried to avoid that. I don't think we avoided it completely. There's chapters that are pretty heavy going, but in general, I think we tried to get to the interesting stuff. You mentioned, we mentioned this Joseph Rosa. Anybody that wants to know everything about Hickok ought to read anything that Rosa wrote. Tremendous scholar. He was British, and he investigated every single thing that Hickok did, and talked to his relatives and went to the sites. And it's an interesting book, but at the same time, he's up against the same thing. You can't substantiate so much of his life. There are sources, but the sources don't really lead you anywhere. We used Rosa as one of our major sources. Couldn't have done the book without Rosa. In fact, big fan. But I think this is a case of a subject becoming almost. You're trying to make more out of Hickok maybe than really was there.
Well, and Rosa comes to Hickok via early television shows.
Yep.
So here we have the premier historian of Hickok. He gets it on the evening, whatever it was, BBC special of some kind.
Yeah, his father was a war veteran. This is an interesting story in itself. During the Second World War, and his father wouldn't talk about the war, but there was movies playing in Britain, cowboy movies, mostly Wild Bill Hickok. So his father took him to see one of these movies, and his father, after seeing the movie with him, then talked about the Second World War. In other words, it was kind of an icebreaker. And then he started watching television. But yes, he came right out of the popular culture. That's exactly how he got interested in it. That's the way most of us get interested in any of these Civil War figures.
Well, I think Rosa is a tangent to something illustrative here, what I was harping on earlier about the culture of violence. You notice, and I hate to pick on American culture too much, but it deserves it. The idea of violence as entertainment. Watch an American mystery show or crime show of some kind, and there's almost inevitably a resolution as I mentioned earlier, that the way you solve the problem is you shoot the guy. Okay, watch them in Britain. Things like Inspector Lewis and Endeavor, or in the Agatha Christie tradition, or the Conan Doyle tradition. When you've got a crime, what do? You've got an intellectual problem to solve. That's unthinkable in our evening TV. Intellectual crap, look at this, slap him.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And I don't know that there's anything inherent in our national character. We just found a formula that works. You know, we can do Agatha Christie too, but you know, it's much more, it's going to get many more people into the theater if we have somebody blazing away by the end of it. It's just a formula. And I'm afraid the press has always been complicit in that. We just like entertaining stories, and what's more entertaining than action? And action is associated with violence.
Yeah, and you think about the way the European, again back to Rosa, the historian, approaches this versus the noir tradition. Well, the French invented the word, and then that was about it. Americans mastered it in terms of the noir mystery, and it follows the same pattern. The British, and I was been reading some German stuff, not in German stuff, and it's very much an intellectual, psychological kind of issue, problem. Someone might get shot after about page 300, but the American noir tradition, no, that's Mike Hammer. You go out and thrash somebody.
So you mentioned Rosa coming to Wild Bill through pop culture. How did you guys come to him as you know, what was your first exposure to him?
Well, I'm probably guilty of that. So,
I agree.
You know, like every other kid of the era in which I grew up, I was interested in cowboys and Indians. You couldn't turn a television set on without seeing 38 westerns back to back. So it was something that I think was psychologically there. And I also noticed in reading about the 50s, which is another one of my interests, the Cold War era, lots and lots of people, males in particular, but not exclusively, they seem to go back to the 50s with a certain nostalgia about this, the war period. So I think that Hickok arrived at this simply because I think both of us, both Ed and I, are interested in the West. And we hadn't done much with the West, except for the Custer book, of course, was mostly about Custer and the Civil War in the East. But we got into the West, and Ed's traveled out there more than I have. And so there's a certain fascination with it. And as far as the Civil War goes, you know, we have this whole half of the Civil War, these big battles that were fought out in the West that don't get nearly the attention that the battles do in Fredericksburg and in Virginia, where you are. And Hickok was involved in Wilson's Creek, Pea Ridge, and Westport. Those are three big battles where he was a participant in some way. So this was almost too good to pass up. You've got a Western figure, you've got a huge myth. He comes out of the Civil War, and Hickok's a kind of glorified veteran. And like even the veterans we see today, they struggle with re-entering into the culture. I think that's goes back to Ulysses, you know, coming out of a war into the so-called peaceful culture after the war is a difficult thing to do. And he's full of this. So that's had a lot to do with why we picked him, I think. Plus, he was in the news, movies were being made about him. So, and then finally, I guess the answer to that is you kind of have to ask yourself, why is this guy so important? Why are there so many books and movies about him? What is it? What's the itch that's being scratched here? And that's a question I think we have even at the end of the book.
Paul, before I ask Ed that same question, we got to see the little Wild Bill figure again. Very good.
And notice how spiffy the figure is. He's well dressed.
How about you? What was your first exposure to Wild Bill?
Well, Paul was. I mean, I was going to suggest therapy when he said, we need to do Wild Bill, you know, and I think we just come off Custer at that point. And that was probably not a bad lead into it, in the sense of so much mythology surrounds Custer, but I didn't expect the degree of mythology that surrounds Hickok. I mean, with Custer, he was an accomplished field commander. Give him credit for that. He was a showboat, etc., good looking, and he died properly. But with Hickok, actually strip all the showmanship away, strip all this away, and what have you got? A good-looking thug with a gun.
Yeah, that's important for the standpoint of the press too. And of course, you can do this in the movies. And when Hickok,
I think you've got something going on there, Paul.
you were asking me a minute ago about retirement projects, and you've got one book over here and another one over here, and you read them concurrently, and things start to go haywire. But anyway, yeah. So what happens, I think, is that the character gets into the movies because he is perceived as an attractive character, physically perhaps, and also in terms of his story. And so there've been a lot of interesting actors that have played Hickok. Have you seen, for example, remember the Deadwood series?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. That's probably the best characterization done of Hickok. And he's just an interesting character to watch. In fact, Custer's wife, Libby, wrote about Hickok, as did her husband. And in one passage, she describes him as something as most beautiful physical specimen of a man who gets on his horse with such grace. I don't know how George Armstrong Custer liked that comment, but it was this sort of fascination people had with him as a physical figure. He was tall of stature, which made him bigger than most men at the time. And you know, he also had these props, as Ed said earlier. You know, he's got a frock coat. He's got his revolvers turned around, and he's you know, he's got a certain style and swagger. And you see this in the photographs in the book, and they're very much staged. You see somebody who's very very interested in his appearance, and you know, it strikes a pose. And all this has something to do with it. And of course, the press, as you can imagine, loves this sort of thing. And he's good to illustrate. How many illustrations did you find, Ed, of Hickok?
Oh,
the pencil seemed to have.
It was countless.
Yeah.
But then again, he was easy to illustrate.
Yeah.
You know, he was. You didn't want to make an ugly guy into someone good looking. Well, you could, but it's easier to start with a good looking guy, and then that naturally morphs into the movie and TV stars of this era. It's easy to do. And of course, people had some, well, those that wanted it had a good frame of reference already. They had an idea what he looked like. So it wasn't tough to pull a guy out in Hollywood and say, okay, get the handlebar mustache and let's get you a vest on and let your hair grow and you'll be a perfect Wild Bill. And yeah, it worked.
Now, we've gotten a lot of comments about this book cover here. And you see this fella on the cover of the book, and I've written a little explanation who this is. An old friend of mine from 50 years ago, and he's an actor, and he plays Western figures in Wild West shows in Colorado. He's a wonderful reenactor and cinematographer and filmmaker, and his specialty is Doc Holliday and Custer. So why use him for a Hickok photograph? Well, the photo shows the character sort of looking down as Hickok himself might have looked had he been sitting across at a card table. The other thing is that in all the descriptions of Hickok that we saw, he's described as being blonde. He's just blonde. You know, we know Custer was blonde, but because of the black and white photographs, you don't get this sense. Well, David Wright is blonde. So he probably looks more like the real Hickok in this photo than any of the illustrations we have in the book. And he is a great example of what we're talking about, because he has made a career out of just portraying Western figures at West shows, and they get thousands of people. It's like your Civil War reenactments in Virginia, Chris, the same basic idea. People like a show and they're fascinated by what these characters look like and what they represent. Maybe that's
and the reenactments, don't they tell us something? That to go out and reenact gunning down 100 people, this is great entertainment, and I love participating in it as long as I don't get blood on me. It's and what happens in Deadwood during tourist season? You have a daily walk down and shootout, and that's entertaining. So sure.
Say, Chris, what is the reenactment scene like in Virginia these days? Still active?
It's actually been shrinking. There's always still one up at Gettysburg, but for instance, in Spotsylvania, they've had to cancel it just because it has not been commercially viable. And kind of going back to Ed's point about violence is entertainment, and people have to pay a ticket charge to come in, and so it is a spectacle. And I think that unfortunately, just because more people are getting out of reenacting, it's expensive. For all sorts of different reasons, that scene has been drying up. Now, what you do see a fair amount of would be living history events, where, for instance, a national park might have a living history event where they've got reenactors set up in a camp setting or something like that, or they've got their horses out and you can talk to them about cavalry. So it's a more personal interaction than the big spectacles of old. So let me ask you, why are we still fascinated with Wild Bill today? I mean, he's obviously had a very robust life in popular culture, but the era of the 1950s Westerns is bygone, but yet we still all know the name Wild Bill. Why is he still fascinating us?
Great question. Who knows? I mean, Westerns were tremendously popular during the Eisenhower era, but they never die. I mean, I think the death of the Western has been predicted for years. It still seems to be a trope that is reinvented over and over again in movies, just about the time when people say they won't sell, a Western comes out and it gets a huge audience. The answer to your question is probably our inherent fascination with violence. And also I'd suggest it has something to do with nostalgia. I mean, as the world gets more complicated, who wouldn't, want to swagger into a saloon in Deadwood?
Well, I think you're right.
Had to be easier in those days than the stuff we have to put up with. And sure, I mean, your life expectancy might have been pretty short, but what the heck? It beats a faculty meeting, I mean, just anything that would get you back into an America that was robust and expanding and confident and all of this. It's so much fun to read about because it's so unlike our own area with all its complexities.
But don't you think he endures? I mean, he came up because of the values that he reflected or that we wanted him to reflect. And he endures, he and lots of others, because of the durability of their values in our culture. The whole idea of the West as a violent place, this comes about to a great extent with Roosevelt's history around the turn of the century. And then it's cemented in academia and other places with Frederick Jackson Turner, that it's the frontier that defines our culture. Well, what do we do with the frontier? We conquer it, and the problems in it, like Indians, you take care of them. And so it's implicit in Turner and explicit in Roosevelt. And to this day, this is something, if we suddenly became, and I couldn't imagine it happening, a culture of doves, this guy would be out of fashion quickly, but that's not going to happen.
Paul, you were going to add something?
No, that's an excellent explanation. That's pretty much nails it. I mean, if the culture changed, if the ground completely shifted underneath this. And of course, the character would die off. There's a very good biography by Tom Clavin that's been out for a couple of years on Hickok. Buy it. You go to Barnes and Noble, you'll find stacks of it. Very good book. He's done a good job of just getting the dramatic, popular element of the character, which suggests to me that there's an interest and there's a demand in Western figures. And the psychology of why we like these Western figures is probably got to do with lots of different elements. And of course, the same thing with the Civil War in general. From time to time, I read about, well, the Civil War is now passé, and Ken Burns and all the work that he did is out of fashion. He couldn't do that today and all that. But I doubt it. I just doubt it. I think these things run in some cycles. And the more you begin to study American history, the more this becomes extremely important. And I have to say that in talking about this, I think Ed and I have both found, you go to the public library, for example, and give a talk on some aspect of the Civil War, and the place is packed. Yeah. You've got these Civil War roundtable groups that are very active. We have a very active one in Knoxville. And you wonder, why are these people here? What are they looking for? What is the fascination they have with the Civil War and the Western reenactments and so forth? I think they're just hungry for some sense of what the country's about and how we got where we are. And that's a good thing.
Yeah, I would agree that having those conversations, asking those questions, exploring that hunger is vital to our sense of identity and where we're going. So we've been talking about the book, Imagining Wild Bill, James Butler Hickok, and War, Media, and Memory. I've got glare on my book cover here. But let me ask each of you to maybe just again talk about the 5 books that have preceded the 4 books that have preceded this one, just so folks can go out and maybe find those as well.
Okay, I'll take the first 2 and let Ed have the final word. Okay, so we start with John Mosby, this Confederate raider from the Virginia area. And that was a fascinating story because Mosby operated just outside of Washington. And because he was so close to the media capital, he also became a figure of myth and legend because he was fun to write about. And it was a flamboyant character that had a hat with a plume on it, and he kidnapped Union generals and did all. Was this of any military importance? Not much, but some would argue perhaps more military importance than others. And when we rolled out the popular culture, we found out that this rather obscure character, except probably in Virginia and real Civil War circles, was quite a prominent figure. And lived a long time. It's another thing. If you're going to be a hero in this country, either die young or live to be about 95. So you keep adding to your legend. And Mosby lived a long time. Forrest, of course, is a whole different thing. He's one of the most controversial figures in American history, lionized by some and damned by others. A figure who's supposedly one of the absolutely great military geniuses of the war and maybe of American history, but at the same time a rather dastardly figure that has been associated with all sorts of terrible things, including the Ku Klux Klan and other things. So was a different kind of book to write. The Sherman book, Ed can talk about this. Of course, what's more important than Sherman's march and a sense of total war and the outcome of the Civil War?
Yeah, well, you mentioned the ambivalence about Forrest, and that I think that follows through with a lot of the books we looked at, that people are ambivalent about it, including our last one here, a lawman who's a gunslinger. What do you do with that? Well, that's part of the fun of it. But back to others, with Sherman, it was almost whimsically that we came to it, because I do remember, and I can't really repeat the language that I got, but Paul and I sitting in my office, and I said, I've raised the issue, what about? And I don't know why I brought it up. Maybe I had been to Savannah. This was a family deal, picking up my son for something. And what about, he's an interesting guy. And in so many words, Paul suggested that I needed some serious therapy. And then he basically comes back to my office the next day with this stack of books, throws them on the desk. Well, when do we start? So we were off to the races. And no matter how you approach Sherman, he's just a darned interesting character. And of course, the mythology there is the rampage across the South. He was a very calculating character. And that's one of the things that comes out rather quickly in looking at him. You know, the myth of just burning a 60-mile swath across the South. No, he didn't. He spent months studying census data to know which routes to take. I mean, this isn't interesting, but you know, burning down and killing people and doing things like that, that's fun to watch. Custer, I was guilty of that, of initiating that, because I'd been out west to the Little Bighorn. And I was early one day. I got to the park entrance, and I was the first car there. This was a summer day. And so it was just me. I was waiting for him to open the gate. Wonderful rangers and park service people out there. And so I just kind of meander around looking at things, no intention of doing something with this character. And it wasn't within the hour. Busloads of people were coming in. One group notably from Asia. A whole load of them. What? Are you kidding? Why? What are you doing here? I mean, I didn't ask them that, but why would you be here? And then I started talking to one of the rangers, and I wish I had her name, but she starts telling me stories that she gets from people, or questions about the Custer myth, as I would call it. But that's not how they're posing it. Well, I understand that he died up there and he was standing. Well, of course, no one asked the obvious. How would you know where he died if everyone died who was there? How do you know he was the last man standing? You can't. It's not possible, I would argue. And then, of course, the best one was the guy that she's explaining the movement of the troops. And he goes, gosh, I wonder why they didn't take cover behind that monument up there. Well, how do you pass that up? It was wonderful. And so that got us going with Custer, and I wasn't able to fish in the Little Bighorn. So,
of course, Custer was a substantial figure in the Civil War. That was quite interesting. We did a lot of research on his role during the Civil War itself, which, of course, a lot of people know little or nothing about because he's been so eclipsed by what he did in the West. So, you know, I hadn't realized it until we just talked about this. But each one of these books had a connection with another one. I mean, there was something that led from one into the other. I could kind of draw a line showing how it all kind of connected. And Hickok, of course, was friendly with Custer and scouted for him. So I think that's another reason we migrated to Hickok. We seem to be moving further west in our books. We're going to have to go to California for the next one.
And I'll make sure we have something posted on the blog so folks can link to these books and find them, because it's a great set of reading, and the explorations you guys do into this process of mythologization is fascinating. Do you guys have a next book you guys are thinking about?
Gosh, I hope not. I think we probably both reached the end of the story, you know, the proverbial journalistic 30, you know, which says the story is finished, but never say never. Who knows what might be next.
Very good. Very good. Well, I have enjoyed the opportunity to chat with both of you and really love this book. I give it a strong endorsement, and I'm really delighted to be associated with it in a meager way, because the work that you two have done is just incredible stuff, and I'm really grateful for it. Paul, Ed, thank you so much for both being with us.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.
Great. And good luck with the book. I'm Chris Mackowski for Emerging Civil War. Thanks for joining us. We will see you online and on the battlefield.